But what you could do with nuclear weapons is use a small number of them to convince the other side that you were deadly serious.
The West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path.
And the Israelis are executing a genocide in Gaza.
It's not China's fault that it wants to be powerful.
So if you get into trouble and you dial 911, there's nobody at the other end.
Hi, this is John Mearsheimer. And what I'd like to talk about today is nuclear weapons, and in particular, tactical nuclear weapons. There have been a lot of reports in the press that the United States is very interested in, quote unquote, expanding its options when it comes to nuclear use. And in that context, there has been much talk about relying more on tactical nuclear weapons for purposes of deterrence and for purposes of warfighting moving forward. And I'd like to talk about this issue of tactical nuclear weapons and what's going on here, what's driving this interest in tactical nuclear weapons, and whether or not it makes sense. Now, with regard to what's driving the interest in tactical nuclear weapons, I think, first of all, there's no question that the United States is very interested in having many options when it comes to employing its nuclear forces. You want to remember that when the United States first developed its nuclear arsenal after World War II, and especially in the 1950s, it employed a policy of massive retaliation. And there were not a lot of options built in to the American doctrine for employing nuclear weapons. Again, the emphasis was on massive retaliation, not flexible response or flexible options. But as time went by, certainly starting in the late 1950s, early 1960s, we began to think long and hard about just having a lot more flexibility in terms of how we use those nuclear weapons. So I find it hardly surprising that the United States is interested in expanding its options from that perspective. But I actually believe that's not the main force driver here. I believe what really matters is that we have discovered, as a consequence of the Ukraine war, and especially the Iran war, that our conventional forces are much weaker relative to our principal adversaries than we recognized a few years ago. I think what happened here is that during the unipolar moment, the United States basically allowed its industrial base to wither away. And we discovered in the Ukraine war that if you get involved in a conflict with a country like Russia, and this is true of China as well, you need a robust industrial base to produce the weaponry to wage that war. One of the advantages that the Russians have over the Ukrainians and even over the Europeans and the Americans is that the Russians have a robust industrial base. So they can produce weaponry over the long term for purposes of waging a protracted conflict. If the United States were to get involved in a war with China, China has a robust industrial base, and it could continue that war for years on end. The United States would be in deep trouble after a few months because, again, it does not have a sufficient industrial base to wage a protracted conventional war. And then, of course, if you go to the Iran war, it's very clear that we have run down our stockpile of precious munitions in that conflict. And the end result is that our conventional deterrence has been weakened. You always want to remember that if you're the United States or any other great power, and you're thinking about deterring an adversary, you rely on both conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. And you pay careful attention to what the balance is between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. But we're in a situation now, the United States, where our conventional forces have been greatly weakened as a result of the Iran war and as a result of supplying the Ukrainians with weaponry. And furthermore, as I said, we also realize that we do not have a robust industrial base, which would put us at a disadvantage in a protracted conventional war. Right? So given that our conventional deterrence has been weakened, it's hardly surprising that people are now beginning to pay more attention to nuclear deterrence, because that's the way this works. And what's going on, apparently, is that a lot of people seem to think that if we emphasize nuclear deterrence, we should pay careful attention, or maybe special attention is a better way to put it, to tactical nuclear weapons. The tactical nuclear weapons are well suited for use on the battlefield. If you get involved in a war, whether it's in Europe or in East Asia, and you don't feel that you have sufficient conventional forces, you can fight that war with tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think this is true. I think this kind of thinking is misguided, and I'd like to make the case for why I think that's the case. And the best way to do it is to go back to the 1950s, which is a period where we emphasized employing tactical nuclear weapons, and talk about our experience in the 1950s, and to focus laser-like on a particular operation that took place. This was a war game called Carte Blanche that took place in June of 1955. It ran from June 20th, 1955 to June 28th, 1955. Talk about Carte Blanche. But before I get to Carte Blanche, I just want to paint a broad stroke picture of how we thought about deterrence in Europe in the 1950s. The United States and its allies, of course, were interested in deterring the Soviet Union. And when you talk about deterrence, it's important to understand that you also have to be concerned with warfighting, because deterrence might not work. Deterrence might fail. And if deterrence fails, then you have to fight a war. So the United States throughout the 1950s thought long and hard about how to deter the Soviets from attacking into Western Europe, and should deterrence fail, how to fight a war against the Soviet Union. Now, the problem that the Americans faced from their perspective was that the Soviet Union had a formidable conventional army. Remember, the Soviet Union played the principal role in defeating the Wehrmacht in World War II. So throughout the 1950s, most Western defense experts or Western policymakers viewed the Soviet military, and especially the Soviet army, as a formidable force. Furthermore, it's very important to understand that West Germany, which eventually became a key player in the NATO alliance, did not become a member of NATO until 1955, and it did not begin rearming until 1955. So from the period from 1950 to 1955, there was, in effect, no German army. Furthermore, the French were busy fighting against the Vietnamese in Indochina. You remember the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which put an end to the French position in Vietnam, took place in 1954. So France was distracted in a very important way. There was no German military of any consequence. And the United States had limited forces in Europe, limited conventional forces. So what we decided to do in the 1950s was to deploy large numbers of tactical nuclear weapons to Europe and rely heavily on tactical nuclear weapons, not only for deterrence purposes, not only to deter a Soviet conventional attack, but for warfighting purposes as well. And by the way, this is why the United States has never had a no first use policy. The United States has never had a no first use policy because it has always understood that it might have to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation if it was losing a conventional war against the Soviet Union. So in the 1950s, when NATO conventional forces were not especially strong and the Soviet Union presented a formidable threat, we believed that if deterrence failed and the Soviets were to attack, we would have to turn to nuclear weapons very quickly, if not immediately. Right? So it's just very important to understand that tactical nuclear weapons were seen for much of the 1950s as a magic weapon. Now, what happened to throw cold water on this whole line of thinking was a war game that was run in mid-June 1955. This is called Carte Blanche. And we hypothesized a situation where the Soviets would attack with conventional forces. We would use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in response. And of course, the Soviets would use nuclear weapons of their own. Now, what happened in this war game? Basically, about 3,000 NATO aircraft from 11 different countries were employed in the war game. And about, I'd say, 335 nuclear weapons were employed. The usual range is 335 to 355. That's how many tactical nuclear weapons were employed in this war game. And by the way, the Russians, of course, employed nuclear weapons as well as the NATO forces in this war game. And in fact, the Russians or the Soviets ended up using or deploying or exploding more nuclear weapons, slightly more nuclear weapons than NATO did. But let's say the total was about 335 nuclear weapons. And the war was fought almost exclusively on West German soil. Now, what was the end result? The end result is that 1.7 million Germans died, West Germans died, and 3.5 million West Germans were wounded. Moreover, these numbers don't take into account the subsequent deaths that would occur as a result of the radiation poisoning. So you just want to think about that. You had a war game that went from June 20th to June 28th. This is 1955, the middle of the 50s. And it ended up with 1.7 million West Germans dead. What does this tell you? In effect, it tells you that you're destroying Germany to save Germany. This operation, this war game, was viewed as evidence that it was hard to see how you could defend West Germany with tactical nuclear weapons without destroying it as a functioning country. And it raised all sorts of concerns, unsurprisingly, in West Germany about whether this was a viable strategy for defending Germany or defending Western Europe against a possible Soviet attack. When people calculated how much destruction had resulted from this war game, it became clear to many people that given this level of destruction, tactical nuclear weapons did not make much sense. There was another dimension that came into play here that really mattered, and that's the issue of escalation. In the war game itself, it became very clear that it was hard to control escalation. And there is no question that it's hard to draw a clear line between tactical nuclear weapons, intermediate range nuclear weapons, and strategic nuclear weapons. And not only is it hard to draw that line, it's a slippery slope, so that once you start using tactical nuclear weapons, you quickly find yourself in a situation where you're thinking about using intermediate range nuclear weapons or strategic nuclear weapons. On top of that, because we thankfully have never had a nuclear war, we have very little understanding of the dynamics of escalation in a nuclear war. And you want to understand that in a nuclear war, if you're interested in limiting it to West Germany, here we're talking about the NATO scenario, you need excellent command and control. And that's true in any nuclear war, right? If you want to keep it limited, you have to have excellent command and control systems. And there's just all sorts of evidence that it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to maintain meaningful command and control as you go up the escalation ladder in a nuclear conflict. So what happens after Carte Blanche is we come to realize that tactical nuclear weapons really are not a viable way of defending West Germany because of the destruction that would be wrought on that country. And furthermore, we come to quickly understand that the threat of escalation is so great that you can't allow yourself to think that you can fight a limited nuclear war of the sort that played out in Carte Blanche and keep it limited. And indeed, there is a serious possibility that if you were in real life to engage in a war in West Germany and the NATO forces and the Soviet forces or the Warsaw Pact forces were to use significant numbers of nuclear weapons, it wasn't clear that you could keep it limited. In fact, there were all sorts of reasons to think it would escalate to a general thermonuclear war, which of course nobody wanted. Anyway, to go back to the 50s, what happens is that in 1957, amazingly, 2 years after Carte Blanche, NATO formalizes a military doctrine. It's called MC 14/2. NATO formalizes a military doctrine which calls for massive use of nuclear weapons to defend Europe and places a great emphasis on using tactical nuclear weapons. That's MC 14/2. And that's approved by NATO in the spring of 1957, 2 years after Carte Blanche. But then what begins to happen over time is that NATO begins to rethink this issue. Given what happened with Carte Blanche, and given all the studies that are subsequently done on the subject of escalation, and nuclear flexibility, we begin to realize that a doctrine for defending Europe that relies on tactical nuclear weapons is not a good idea. In fact, it's a very bad idea. So two things happen here. The first is that NATO decides that it's going to emphasize conventional deterrence much more in the future than it had in the past. Remember, I said before that if you're a great power and you're thinking about how to deter an adversary, you have to think about the balance between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. How much do you want to rely on conventional deterrence? How much do you want to rely on nuclear deterrence? There's no question, given that we live in a nuclear world, that nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence are both going to be present all the time. But the question is, what does the balance look like between the two? And what I'm telling you is that during the 1950, the balance was heavily skewed in favor of nuclear deterrence in Europe. And this, of course, is seen in MC14/2, which is the NATO doctrine that's put into place in the spring of 1957. But what happens over time is that NATO de-emphasizes its reliance on nuclear deterrence, and it begins to build formidable conventional forces, and it begins to rely much more on conventional deterrence. And this is possible in good part because the German army comes online after 1955. Remember, Germany joins NATO in 1955, and Germany rearms in 1955, or it starts rearmament in 1955. This is the same year, same time frame as Carte Blanche. And what happens over the course of the second half of the 1950s and the early 1960s is the Germans develop a very formidable fighting force, conventional fighting force. Remember, the Germans did not have nuclear weapons at the time. The Germans, of course, still have no nuclear weapons. But the Germans had a very formidable conventional army. And the United States commits to building more powerful conventional forces in Europe as well. And we begin to de-emphasize nuclear deterrence, which is another way of saying we begin to de-emphasize our emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons, and we rely much more on conventional deterrence. Now, the second thing that we do is that we fully understand that we want to continue to rely on nuclear deterrence. If conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence fail to stop the Soviets from attacking, and the Soviets attack, we will first try to stop them conventionally. This is what happens in the 1960s. We decide by then that if the Soviets attack into Western Europe, we will first try to stop them with the formidable conventional forces that NATO built up in the late 50s and in the early 1960s. And you want to remember that back in the mid-50s, at the time of Carte Blanche, if the Soviets were to attack, we would almost automatically go to using tactical nuclear weapons. There's no real conventional deterrence there. For warfighting purposes, we were going to rely on tactical nuclear weapons. That all changes by the early 1960s, and of course, we're relying on conventional deterrence. But everybody fully understands that there's a possibility that the conventional forces will fail to stop the Soviets, and the Soviets and their allies in the Warsaw Pact will overrun Europe, Western Europe. So the question that NATO then faces is, how should it think about using its nuclear weapons? Now, everybody remembers what happened with Carte Blanche, right? So there's zero incentive to fight a conventional war, let me put it differently, to fight a war, a failed conventional war with tactical nuclear weapons in West Germany. So there's no incentive to massive use of tactical nuclear weapons should the conventional forces of NATO fail to stop the Warsaw Pact conventional forces. So what NATO does is come up with a clever doctrine. It says that should the Warsaw Pact begin to overrun NATO's conventional forces, what NATO will do is it will deploy a handful of nuclear weapons against targets, maybe in East Germany, maybe in Czechoslovakia, maybe in Poland, just a handful of nuclear weapons to convey to the Soviet Union that it was deadly serious about stopping the war and preventing the Warsaw Pact from overrunning all of Europe. In other words, what NATO planned to do was to launch a very limited nuclear attack for throwing both sides out on the slippery slope to oblivion. NATO was not interested in launching a handful of nuclear weapons to win the war in any military sense. NATO had figured out, as a result of Carte Blanche and the subsequent analysis that was done, that you could not win a war with nuclear weapons. But what you could do with nuclear weapons is use a small number of them to convince the other side that you were deadly serious about coercing them to stop their attack. And it was really the threat of escalation that was at the heart of this strategy. In other words, the idea was that if you used a handful of nuclear weapons, there would be an ever-present threat of further escalation. If the Soviets didn't stop their conventional offensive against Western Europe, the United States would use maybe a few more nuclear weapons. And who knows where this would lead. So you see that what happens is that it's not that tactical nuclear weapons or small nuclear weapons disappear. What happens is that NATO thinks about using those nuclear weapons in a much more limited way, in a way that has really nothing to do with warfighting. MC 14/2, this is the 1957 version of NATO strategy on the employment of nuclear weapons. It's MC 14/2, basically calls for warfighting with tactical nuclear weapons. If you look at MC 14/3, which is adopted by NATO in 1967, 10 years later, it calls for using nuclear weapons in a very limited way for purposes of basically putting both sides out on the slippery slope to oblivion and convincing the Soviets, or the Warsaw Pact in this case, that it should stop its offensive against Western Europe because the United States will increase the number of its attacks with nuclear weapons if the Soviets don't stop. And at some point, this could escalate into a general thermonuclear war that the Soviet Union certainly does not want. Now, there are many people who think that NATO's strategy, as laid out in MC 14/3, makes no sense. That's an issue for another day. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the United States of America once upon a time placed a great emphasis on nuclear deterrence and nuclear warfighting with tactical nuclear weapons. And the logic that was employed in that case had to do with the fact that we did not feel that we had sufficient conventional forces to deter or fight the Soviet Union. We didn't have sufficient we didn't have sufficient conventional deterrence, and therefore we had to rely on nuclear deterrence, which in effect meant employing tactical nuclear weapons. But it quickly became clear with Carte Blanche that that was simply not a viable strategy. And we moved away from it. And again, we moved away from it in two ways. And by the way, those two ways all were placed under the umbrella of flexible response, right? The first way we moved away from it was we increased our conventional capabilities on the Central Front in Europe. We shifted the balance between nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence in favor of conventional deterrence, number one. And number two, we abandoned the idea that you could fight a nuclear war with tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. And we instead adopted this policy, to use Thomas Schelling's language, that might be called manipulation of risk. We were using a handful of nuclear weapons to manipulate the Soviets by threatening the possibility of escalation to the general thermonuclear level. Now, what does this tell us about the situation that we're in today? It tells us that we're in a lot of trouble because our conventional forces have been weakened, and therefore there is a powerful incentive to rely more on nuclear deterrence than we have in the past, or at least since the 1950s. And this is not a good thing. You want to have a deterrent posture that relies on conventional forces and nuclear forces. But you want the nuclear forces in the background, you want the conventional forces up front. But the problem we face, and this is certainly true in East Asia today, is that we are in a position where our conventional forces, our conventional deterrent, is nowhere near as formidable as it should be, for a variety of reasons that are subject for another day. And therefore, we're thinking about relying more on nuclear deterrence. And of course, this has pushed us to think about tactical nuclear weapons. But as Carte Blanche shows, this is not a viable strategy. There's no way the United States can fight a war with tactical nuclear weapons in Europe or in East Asia and win that war in any meaningful way. Carte Blanche shows that very clearly, and nothing has changed since then. And furthermore, the threat of escalation is ever present. So all of this is to say that what the United States should do moving forward, instead of relying on tactical nuclear weapons for warfighting purposes, is get back to the business of building up its conventional deterrent and thinking about using nuclear weapons, if need be, in a much more selective and coercive way of the kind that is embodied in MC 14/3, which, as I said, became NATO doctrine in 1967. That concludes my episode for today. I'm quite confident that there'll be many more episodes down the road that deal with different aspects of the nuclear issue, because there's almost no question that given the way events are evolving in the world today, nuclear issues of all sorts will become much more important to talk about than has been the case in recent decades. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode.